Paul, why don't you start, and I'll take
Govind, I have a question. So, at first reading your paper, I thought, and this is, I think, a problem with just my reading it quite quickly. I thought you were, well, let me back up. I promise this won't be long-winded, but in like I'm teaching a public health school. I think you do too. So in public health, you have like a statistic that gets thrown around that healthcare only contributes 10% to health, which is, from what I can tell, is just a number plucked out of the air. There's really no basis to that. But suppose that it were true, and then it leads some people to say, okay, well, we put all this money into healthcare, perhaps it should go to public health or social determinants of health, and then you have a question about, whether or not any money at all and how much should go to health care. And at first I thought that you were tackling that problem or addressing that problem, but at a wider level, which is not just could this healthcare dollar produce health better somewhere else, but could this healthcare dollar produce WALYs, well-being adjusted life years, better somewhere else? But then you opened with the observation that health policy affects the environment or education. And that introduces a distinct issue, which is related to your Magi anecdote, which is about coordination and undoing what another sector has done. And I was just wondering if you had teased those two issues out in your mind, and how you wanted us to think about those two issues side by side.
Great question. So I think, the Magi example is sort of cute, which is why I like it. But you're right that it's sort of just an instance of a more general case. So I think one of the starkest cases of not attending to the effects of whatever you're doing within policy on, as you put it, sort of well-being adjusted life years is something like the being an exactly cross-purposes case. But there are other cases that also have that feature. So I think what I should say, I don't think I sort of separated those goals enough in the way that I presented it, is that I think even if you're not committed to a sort of broad, well-being-based sort of mode of evaluation, and I can say more about this in response to other questions, I don't think you have to be a consequentialist to be committed to sort of caring about distributions of well-being broadly. But even if you're not committed to that, it's hard to see what's to be said for something that's really starkly at cross purposes like the Magi case. I think there's a further question about whether there's any basis for sort of giving some extra weight to your own sphere. The problem is that if you give some extra weight, you still can end up in the same way as the money pump problem. You don't have to have really starkly cycling preferences to end up in a money pump. Even if you just have a slight preference, it'll still happen. And so I think there is a tough question about whether you can, whether you really can give any extra consideration to your own specific sphere. So I think, is that helpful, or is that still not? Oh, great.
Bill.
So for making this paper, it's really fascinating. The first thing it made me think of was that scene in Annie Hall where the 5-year-old Woody Allen stopped doing his homework because he hears about peak out of the universe, and his mother's bringing him in. And eventually it sounds like they kind of settle on something like, neutrality in the sense you need to kind of, there's ways to find meaning here and now. I wonder though, in terms of the kind of different nihilisms you map out, it seems to me there's another sort of nihilism which in Nietzschean language would be something like the eternal return to the same, which is, or you could Fukuyama, like the end of history, that people look forward to. It may still be 100 years out, but technology solves our problems, we have material abundance. And there's something like, actually, a lot of people find that deeply demoralizing, in the sense that human history is a struggle of all these accomplishments and overcoming stuff, in some sense comes to an end. And you might imagine those sorts of people demoralized by that saying, actually, no, climate change, that's interesting. Like the fact that we have to deal with a comet and fend it off with a nuclear weapon, I mean, that opens up drama in human history. So there's a way in which, I guess, the ever burgeoning threat of these, troubles that might extinguish us gives meaning to life, and there seems to be something meaningful about struggles that maybe just the eternal return to everything as it always is, which seems to be a source of meaning on this one account. ends up sort of drying up meaning over the time.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting topic, and I think that there's only so far we can go as philosophers in the seminar room of actually answering these questions of what encourages or discourages people from making meaning assignments to events in their lives. Like, it's the kind of thing we can offer different theories, so we can propose something like the permanence principle in the paper. Like, if I suddenly find myself in the grips of the view that nothing I do can make any lasting difference in the world, then that reduces my ability to assign meaning. Or you might think, like, no, the presence of like some struggle that my efforts will somehow be involved in will increase meanings. It increases like the narrative force of how I like narrate my life. These are all interesting hypotheses, and it's the kind of thing that like I think philosophers pose these questions, and then frankly we need our colleagues in psychology to help us get to the bottom of the answers. I heard a great podcast on the flight over here. Is it Dan Ariely at Duke? Who's doing, he's really interested in studying meaningfulness, and he did this really torturous experiment with a bunch of Duke undergraduates where he had them come in the room and they were building little Lego robots, like bionicle robots. Yeah. And in like one condition, you'd build a robot and then you could like, I don't know, get paid to build another one, and you got paid decreasing amounts for each robot you built. So $3 was first robot labor and then down from there, and see how long people would go. And then the next condition, you were still building robots, same price points, but the experimenter, after you built the first robot, would take it apart in front of you and figure people are much less likely to work, people give up on robot construction tasks much more quickly if they feel like it's part of something that's futile. So I think, I think this is very minor evidence from social psychology against our ability to find meaning necessarily in narratives of struggle. But I think your point, there's certainly another independent question about what we think our efforts will be replaced, and this all gets into these questions of what makes an appropriate connection fact, and how far out can they be, and what makes those facts themselves valuable enough to be the kinds of things that can imbue our activities with meaning. I think these are all just awesome questions, and ones that we probably need more interdisciplinary help to answer.
Eric. Yeah, thanks. So I have questions I wanted to ask for everybody, but I think I want to focus on Gavin if I could. So first let me say I start with huge skepticism about things that are on the screen right now, right? Namely, the knowledge problems that people with these agencies have, and also power problems and all that. But let's suppose, you can imagine somebody saying, and this is a different direction I'm taking now, well, why not have one gigantic agency that is charged with producing the optimal mix of all these different types of things? And we would tend to reject that, I think, on grounds that maybe separate agencies would have more specialized knowledge. I think that would be the main reason for doing that. And so if we imagine these agencies and imagine that they do have some worthwhile specialized knowledge, then I think, right, the next step is, well, some sort of coordination among them. Right? So my only contribution is to make a suggestion about what that coordination might sometimes be. And it might sometimes be some agencies saying the best way we should advance or maintain the values that we're in charge of, which are threatened by what some other agency, is to pay them not to do it. Right? And then that other agency can make a judgment about whether or not the receipt of those funds will enable them in some other way to advance their agenda. So there might be room in that coordination. In fact, it seems to be a very attractive sort of room within that coordination for this buying and selling among the agencies. That would probably require quite a different view than people normally have about budgets and so on. But that seems to be a crucial element in any fruitful coordination among them.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know that I have any immediate quarrel with that. I think the question is going to be, I think, it sounds like the idea is to have sort of a coordination through a market. Often, I'm not exactly sure it's a market, but coordination. So I think, sometimes they can be really good at coordinating, at other times not so good. I think it reminds me of some of this discussion about using, letting food banks sort of bid with chips, as it were, on, and some of that seems sort of all to the good. The question is sort of, would I be worried about like one agency eventually ending up with all of the resources to be then paying other agencies? I think it'd be really interesting to sort of model this in practice and see how it worked out.
The danger might be agencies proposing to do things which they otherwise wouldn't propose in order to sell their non-conformance of those things. Yeah.
Richard, you have a follow-up?
Just very quickly, I mean, you suggested it would be impractical to have some sort of super organization
Yeah.
with these compartmentalization within it. But that happens all over the place. I mean, universities are like that. Colleges are at each other's throats, looking for a piece of pie. And agencies are like, why not think of it as just an adversarial system where you want each person to present the best argument they can? There has to be a decider. In the case of governments, whoever makes the budget decisions. But yeah, I want to hear your case, I want to hear your case, I want to hear yours. And then that person, to be sure, they probably don't have the knowledge to make a decision, but at least they can hear arguments from people who've gathered lots of facts, presumably, and are in a position to make the arguments.
Donald Trump.
Whoever he picks as his finance secretary, I would imagine.
Michael.
So this is also a question for Bob, and it sort of relates to Eric's question. So I'm wondering if you're ignoring sort of natural justification for focusing on narrow benefits, and that's a division of labor type argument that is based on specialization, where the health minister should only focus on health ministry stuff because they have more knowledge about it, because they can press this case for health benefits best, and then other agencies do the same. And the idea, and this is an empirical question, part is that would produce the most good overall, rather than the health ministry caring about the environment and education as well. And it actually connects with Robert Gooden's work in other areas. So he has an assigned responsibility model in talking about special duties or special obligations. And so the argument there for why countries should focus only on their citizens, not others, is because if each country does that best, then overall the common good will be produced. So can you say more about why you think that would not be a good enough justification for focusing on narrow benefits?
I mean, so if it were, it wouldn't be that the narrow benefits were what they ultimately cared about. It would be that it was sort of a self-effacing reason to care about it. It's that you sort of notice that you're not. It sounds to me like you're not making the case that they should care about health sort of as such. They should act like they care about health insofar as that really promotes what's really of value, which notably isn't sort of only health. So I do think that the question will be, in a way, empirical. It's sort of look at the thought that I have, and this comes back to the comment I made about Broom's view, is that I wonder how much of the sort of salutary effects of people focusing on their specific domains of knowledge you could get out of people using the levers at their disposal. So I'm not saying that the health ministry should propose complicated projects in environmental remediation. I'm saying they can still sort of propose and pursue projects that are focused on sort of using interventions in, say, health care or in public health. It's just that they shouldn't be indifferent to the externalities that their agency conduct would produce. And the worry I have about this, and in a way about the comment you make about Gooden's view about nations, is that that view has the danger that it gives no weight at all to externalities that you would produce for other sectors that you're doing. I take it.
John.
Okay, good. All three of you, thanks for really interesting talks. I think I want to enter the conversation that's grown up in the last couple of minutes, but I first have to give a reference to Megan, since Bill brought up Annie Hall. I know that you want another popular culture analogy that fits perfectly only for those of us who are a little older. In the original Star Trek series, at least 25% of the shows involved Captain Kirk destroying an ideal utopia in which everybody was stagnant, and flying off into space at the end saying human beings have to struggle or life is meaningless. So the idea that somehow meaning we have to be overcoming obstacles, and that's inherent in our nature. At any rate, I was very interested in Govind's talk. He was with us last year. I always find Govind's talk interesting and enlightening, and I find I agree with almost all of it, and yet we still come to different conclusions. It makes things interesting. So I think you're really onto something. The idea that we should be having a wider focus seems entirely correct to me. So where does it lead? So when I went on the list, it was going to be to say, I think it leads in Eric's direction. But it leads in a direction in which what you're going to, if you want to actually achieve the common good, and the problem is the inability to see, you need some coordination mechanism, and it looks like the coordination mechanism is something like a market. Now, Eric said you have a market between the agencies, but if you look at it a little bit more broadly, what you have is a reductio argument. You start with the idea that agencies should be achieving some kind of good. It could be a specific good, could be the common good. That's the goal. And then when you go through all of the steps in analysis, you find out that the best way to achieve it is to have complete market relationships so that you have a way of evaluating on a cost basis analysis what's going to actually achieve that end. Your premises, which seem brilliant to me, could lead in one direction, or they simply could lead as a reductio to say the best way to achieve the common good is to have true market relations, because that's what coordinates these things most effectively. And human beings, to be hierarchical, human beings have limited knowledge. It would be great if we could do better than the trial and error method built into a market. That would be wonderful. Maybe someday we'll become so computerized that that becomes possible, but at least now, given the limitations on our knowledge, what we should do, if you want to achieve the common good, is put it back to the market.
Yeah, I think also something about externalities that I said, and I think people are just going to be differentially worried about these things, but it strikes me as, again, I think markets are great in certain sectors. I feel like for some of these problems, I say this in the paper, the problem of externalities, essentially, and also the problem of once you have some, this is just the sort of theory of the second best problem, leaves me skeptical that sort of, maybe it's, the skepticism is this, I'm not really sure what to say about like the fantasy of like markets with no regulatory structures. But then once you have some regulatory structures, the facts about the theory of the second best make me think that in the end it really is an empirical question in practice whether sort of marketizing things more or less will achieve more optimal outcomes, given that what we know from the theory of the second best is that merely marketizing a mixed system more doesn't necessarily make it work better. That really does end up being an empirical question.
Yeah, but you don't mind if I use your work as a reductio for my own purposes, right?
He still gets the citation.
John.
So this is to Richard. So I was thinking through the profiling problem. You've got two claims. Is it irrational to profile when you're doing it well? Of course not, right? The whole point is it's in good inductive reasoning when it's done well. Is it unreasonable or is it immoral? Possibly separate question. And you say, well, look, okay, maybe it's bad if there are these unseen consequences that we don't take into account, especially when government agencies do it. Probably going to overcorrect and discriminate too much in favor of certain groups or something like that. Okay, let's just include all that. But you say there's nothing intrinsically wrong with it. But I was thinking one argument you could use to defend your conclusion, but on slightly different premises, is let's take Ross seriously. There's different prima facie duties. He's kind of like a consequentialist, even though we think of him as a deontological thinker. Okay, so duty of beneficence. We should promote good consequences by like preventing terrorism and stuff like that, right? Okay, good. Profiling is an effective way to do that when done well. Duty of respect. Okay, well maybe in order to promote good consequences, we have to forego a bit of the duty of respect. So maybe by targeting certain groups, we are more likely to produce these great consequences. But we're also almost certainly going to express disrespect for a certain group. And so what we should do is say, okay, it's not just that there are unseen potential bad consequences. There are also, or just instrumentally bad consequences. There are also intrinsically bad consequences on a Rossian view. It just turns out it's worth it in some cases because of the stakes. So let me give 2 examples. There's the example of preventing terrorism. We disproportionately target young men. I think we should definitely do that. That's pretty much all of the bombers. It disrespects a little bit, express some disrespect, but the consequences are so good, it's worth it. Pick up basketball. I'm white, I play. Usually picked after the black guy. A little bit of disrespect, consequences, also not very, it just doesn't matter that much. Probably we should have a norm against doing it. Something like that. Anyway, those are cases where the consequences are different and where we're weighing up different prima facie duties and it goes in one direction or another.
Yes, these are all interesting thoughts. And as I said, for any view, whether you're a consequentialist or a deontologist, you're going to have to figure out what all these prima facie duties are. If you're Ross, you're going to have to figure out what's intrinsically good or intrinsically bad if you're a consequentialist. I've never been much of a fan for the whole respect thing. I don't know quite what the problem is. I mean, why am I showing disrespect for you if I reach epistemically rational conclusion about the likelihood that you have a certain characteristic based on everything I know about you having other characteristics? I mean, it's just, how does that disrespect you? What am I...
About the belief.
Pardon me? It's not about the belief?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Your response is that it doesn't disrespect Johnny to form a belief, but Johnny's point, I thought, was it's the act, the second part of your
Yeah, but why is that disrespecting you either? I mean, am I disrespecting you if I got somebody just robbed a store? Somebody gives me a fairly detailed description. I'm a cop of the person who robbed the store, and you fit it perfectly. So I stop you, and you start, telling me that I'm disrespecting you as a person. I said, look, you fit the description. What am I supposed to do? I'd be crazy not to stop you. It doesn't seem to me in any way, shape, or form I'm showing disrespect for you as a person, or if I am, I don't know what's wrong with it.
I'm giving you, I think, what the best version of your opponent is going to say. I think that's what they're going to say.
I know,
not just about the
a lot from
consequences.
people. I never understand it. I don't understand that sort of Kantian thing.
But
about
your response
treating
was
people
that
as-
he fits the profile perfectly, and I think Johnny's, I don't know if I can defend it, but Johnny's example was a case where what is this profile that he fits perfectly? Your example was that you're a 5'7" white guy or whatever.
So basketball versus terrorism.
Yeah. And that's
different. Yeah.
It strikes me as, fitting the description perfectly sort of loads the background of your case.
It just increases the probability. I mean, it's still a probability. There's lots of 5 foot, whatever you are, white guys with brown hair. There's lots of them, but there's lots who aren't. And if you're looking for somebody who just committed the crime, you're going to pull over the people who look like that. It's a very high probability. In other cases, it's a lower probability, but why wouldn't I still be perfectly rational in treating you a certain way based on beliefs I have about the likelihood of your being somebody I need to worry about in a certain respect? Again, it doesn't seem to me that... I do think that there are other consequences of doing it, that you better think about long and hard before you engage in it. Probably stop and frisk isn't a good idea. Andrew?
My question is for Megan. I like the idea of trying to shoot for temporal neutrality as a way of avoiding some of the problems of nihilism and subjectivism. And it seems like the position is vulnerable to challenges on both sides, that it has to collapse into one or the other. Because if we're going to be temporally neutral, I can imagine somebody saying, well, what's really doing the work of avoiding nihilism? There's some sort of connection that happens to be a temporal one that's funding meaningfulness in some way. And I imagine it's a corrigible judgment of meaningfulness. So if I find meaningfulness in identifying somehow with those renegade Homo sapiens that mated with Neanderthals when they went into Europe, and I somehow evolved my life around that, that might be odd. And maybe we might be able to say that's a little, it's not really generating meaning. But how are we going to avoid going in one direction or the other? Because it seems like you could say there's some self-justifier at some point. There's some meaning bedrock that's going to get us to it. So some of the examples that you have are dealing with identifying with some linguistic community ancestors. Well, why is that doing any work and generating meaningfulness? And at some point, the person might just say, it just is. So that's going to be subjectivism, or it's going to be some version of nihilism, I'm wondering. And how would you dodge that challenge from either side?
I don't take it in the material I gave you guys. I don't think I've presented any like knockdown arguments against subjectivism. This came up a little bit in conversation with Richard right before the session started. Except me kind of like groaning, just being like, this is like not the ideal solution. Or I at least report as the author and philosopher of this piece that I think that meaning has to be objective, and it's the kind of thing we can make mistakes about, and we can't just manufacture. And that leaves us with this, somebody who's in my position then, in debate with subjectivists, faces this question, okay, what are the real meaningful connections and what are the stupid ones? So the blade of grass one, that's on the stupid end of the spectrum. Maybe the like, feeling of intimate connection with my child, that's on the, okay, probably confident that that's an objectively meaningful connection that you're drawing. Where does learning languages fall? Where does the Homo sapiens, I'm big into podcasts. I fly a lot almost every week, and I listen to like hours and hours and hours of podcasts. And there was a really interesting one a week or two ago about an author who wanted to experience the world the way her dog does. So it's a British woman who went and like spent an entire day just kind of like running around the fields in her house on all four legs and trying to smell things that her dog was interested in smelling, and then wrote about it, like how she formed this really intimate connection with her pet as a result of this. Has she achieved this extra form of value in her life? I mean, we kind of scratch our heads. The fact that I'm willing to scratch my head at some of these is evidence that I'm not, like, why I'm turned off by the subjectivist answer, and why I think that there could be, like, we could get these facts wrong. Like, she thought she was finding meaning, but she really wasn't. Yeah. But as far as like flushing that out with some theory, like, you know, some theory about how you detect whether or not you're successfully pursuing meaning in your life, I've got nothing to offer at this stage, except that I'm interested in it. And I don't think it has to collapse into nihilism or subjectivism. I think it's at least coherent to believe that there is this third category, the kind of meaning that we pursue and don't manufacture, that relies on the appropriate kinds of connections, and then flushing out that theory, probably go back to the ancient Greeks. But anyway, I don't think you've argued that it has to collapse. You just said, like, right. You know, you just pointed out how hard this is going to be.
Yeah.
Jeff.
Yeah, so this is a question for me too. I'm a bit puzzled by the category of meaning and where it gets. So one stage you seem to say that, well, look, we need to hand this over to psychologists, but I'm worried about the prior stipulation. So, you know, I kind of want to sort of understand a little bit about how it enters and what it's contrasted with. So one thought might be, look, people have lots of desires and they're denominated in all sorts of different ways, and here's one of them, the desire for meaning. And, you know, now that would be a question for the psychologists. Ask them, you know, some questions about what gives meaning to their lives and stuff. You don't want to do that, as I understand it. You want to say something like, look, there is this separate thing from meaning. It's separate, as it were, from well-being or utility or the conventional things. It's obedient to certain facts. It's commensurable with utility otherwise understood, but it's not reducible to it. The facts that are relevant are extrinsic. That is, I take it that they're not internal to the procedure. So here's a thought, you know, about what I might think about meaning. I might say, we go to a concert, you know, this is to sort of take up the aesthetic example. We go to a concert and I hear this piece of music and I don't care for it. And you say to me, not, oh, well, it was written by this guy who committed suicide or anything. No, there's not an extrinsic reason in that sense. Listen to this. You know, this is This is the logical progression from Schubert to Stockhausen. This is where this guy locates in this sort of particular trajectory. The right way to hear this is with the musical tradition in Mahn and so on. And I say, yeah, right, you're right, I can hear that. So that gives me an assessment of this piece. But it seems to me it doesn't mean that I like it anymore. That's a different thing. There's lots of music that I can recognise the greatness of, which I don't actually care for. So my question is, would that be meaning? Because that's sort of the word meaning in the context of a tradition that you might value, and pieces of which you certainly value. And if it is, why is it so important to you that it be somehow separate from well-being broadly construed?
So, there are a lot of details in the case. I definitely don't want these. In the literature, there's sometimes this collapse of understanding meaning as to like what some event signifies or some experience signifies. I want to bracket that and think of non-hedonic value as this kind of value that you might pursue the same way you pursue pleasure or the same way you pursue desire satisfaction if you're in a desire satisfaction framework. But it's in a different category. Or we're running with this hypothesis. I haven't given you this great argument for like two-dimensionalism about value at all. I just assumed it and said, like, here's some interesting questions about prudential rationality we can start to raise if we take the framework seriously. But I do kind of, confession time, I do kind of take the framework seriously. I think, we just taught Mill 2 weeks ago to my undergraduates, and thinking about, like, when you come to appreciate Rothko, it's really just pleasure, but it's it's a pleasure that requires a big investment in learning how to appreciate art. But eventually, it's going to bottom out in the same kind of value you get from watching NASCAR races or fried chicken. I think maybe I'm not a great art lover. Maybe art is like that; it's reducible. But there have got to be some kinds of values in our life that just strikes me as really implausible that they're reducible, like parenthood. You can imagine somebody going in, deciding, for prudential reasons, it is going to make my life better on some measure of better to become a parent. But there's going to be a lot more like frustrated desires and pain for the next epoch of my life. That I'm trading that for this other category of meaningfulness or importance. And that's why it's rational for me to do this. I take those kinds of arguments seriously, and that's what I think a framework like this starts to give us at least the categories for asking these questions. But then I think once we ask them, like, this is something philosophers love to guess and project. Mill's a horrible example of this. Just project from what makes me happy to what must clearly be a universal for all humans across time. I think we should avoid doing stuff like that. If we posit this as a separate form of value, then it's the kind of thing we ought to be able at a certain point to turn to our colleagues in empirical psychology and be like, here's a hypothesis. People are willing to make these kinds of trade-offs, or here's a hypothesis, something that they can then go out and test in the field and falsify these theories. But yeah, so I don't know if that's answering your question. Just kind of giving you a pitch to be a little bit more curious about this.
Yeah, no, I'm curious enough.
Yeah.
But I'm not persuaded by the existence of trade-offs.
Yeah.
Because, we have multiple desires, we make trade-offs between the fulfillment of those desires all the time. So that's not going to establish it as a separate category from...
Yeah.
So
I have the feel, again, it's also somewhat new to this literature. You can sometimes get the feeling of vertigo of, then we're just playing this kind of language game of what are we going to call a desire, or whatever, and I'm not as interested in winning some wars about what we're going to label different attitudes in our normative theory as I am of let's come up with real puzzles people face planning for their future. Should I put this money in my retirement account right now, or should I send it to the Sierra Club if I'm just interested in Megan's life going as well as possible? That's a real puzzle where I think right now I've got to do this kind of meaning hedonic benefit trade-off. Should I become a parent? So, we take people making these real decisions, try to find normative categories that help us understand what's psychologically going on with them, and also gives us the resources to theorize about whether they're doing it right. That's kind of my MO. And so at the end of the day, we want to call things desires that first didn't quite fit into how we were talking about desires before. It's fine.
David?
Yeah, thanks. So, Megan, I've been thinking about how your paper relates to the workshop.
Oh no, it's too late.
No, you have to. So yeah, that isn't hostile. I'm thinking that one thing is often what we mean when we speak of, no, you're not just talking about difference or meaning, you're talking about seeing meaning and a felt experience of meaningfulness. But to see meaning is to see difference. And one way to ask about the meaning of it all is to say, what's the difference? So there's a real relationship there. And another thought is that it seems that we see meaning only where we choose to look for it. I mean, if we're not looking for it in our kid, then we're not seeing it. Like Tolstoy has got all kinds of things that would seem meaningful if he chose to see them that way. So we choose whether to look in the realm of, or one of the many realms of remote consequences. And I would suppose, so what would drive us to look in one realm of remote consequences rather than another? And I would think one of the drivers would be depression. And so you think, well, not finding meaning correlates to depression, but as to what's cause and what's effect, that's a different question. So there's a bias that I think some psychologists have talked about anyway, that it seems like, well, maybe not finding meaning is depressing, but maybe the correlation is often a matter of depression aiming to find reasons to be depressed and finding that you're not making a difference in terms of what happens after the next big bang or something. That's you kind of have to be a Woody Allen cartoon to be depressed by that. But in any case, we're talking about aiming at finding arenas where the difference, such difference as we make, can be seen, unless we're depressed. If we're depressed, we're looking for something else. So maybe the correlation between being depressed and not perceiving ourselves to be making a difference, how that correlation, how that bears on causation isn't what it seems.
Good. So, a couple points. One, like I bring up nihilism in public forums, and immediately you think, you get the image of like a philosopher who's dressed all in black, like smoking packs of cigarettes and throwing himself off a precipice, or somebody very much in the grips of depression. And I only know a little bit of Tolstoy's autobiography, but clearly some kind of mental health issue and religious obsession, things that had nothing to do with reasons or philosophical argument, was going on with him at this period of his life. But there's another kind of there's a philosophical sense of nihilism, which I suspect some people in this room already endorse, which is just there is not this second kind of value. So it's just the denial of a form of value that's like posited by the meaning people, and that doesn't require throwing yourself off a cliff or anything. So the first thing I want to say, I want to decouple like senses of nihilism and the kind that I'm arguing, that the kind that I even want to reject is the less like serious and less linked with depression, just the philosophical kind of nihilism that says that these kinds of trade-offs never make sense because there's no value. This kind of value never existed in the first place. So that's the first comment. One other comment, and then you can tell me if I even answered your question. But thinking about the theme of this conference, I could have made this a little bit more clear in my opening remarks. I think when we find ourselves in this two-value framework, or find ourselves taking this concept of meaningfulness seriously, we find a weird puzzle with the kind of Bastiat advice. Like see the remote consequences, appreciate them. One way of reading what happened to Tolstoy or Alvy Singer is they saw the remote consequences and realized, like, crap, all of my assumptions about value I've been pursuing and like what's been rational in my life, once I realize these remote consequences, those assumptions are false. My trade-offs are irrational, and my ways of valuing are not based properly in reasons. So it might be a bit of advice for like tunnel vision. I do think at the end of the day, Scheffler, if you read Scheffler's book, he has a great back and forth with several commentators at the last section of the book, and some of them bring up the Albee Singer problem and press him really hard on it. And he kind of, I think, retreats into this sort of like stop looking so far out. Like he just says, like I don't want to consider those possibilities. Rational people shouldn't dwell on those possibilities that are so far out, at the risk of being an absurdity. But that's not principled. That's not a philosophically satisfying answer. That's just Scheffler reporting how he gets up in the morning. So those are just some comments. I take your general point. I think I don't know. I'll rest it there.
Marcus.
Yeah. So for government, I wanted to throw out the possibility that maybe there is a super agency that coordinates turf wars between agencies, and those are the courts. Ann Joseph O'Connell and Dan Farber at Berkeley have this new paper out on how agencies sue each other all the time, and they're trying to figure out what the appropriate posture of agencies should be. And they take the position in the paper that turf wars are actually good because agencies that have this tunnel vision aren't considering the other implications. And then when they run up against another agency that takes a different view on these turf wars, they have to go before a neutral arbiter, which is in the federal system, the federal courts, and in state agencies, it's the state courts. And there we have this super agency, a judge, who gets to determine whether or not the extended or attenuated implications of the agency action is appropriate.
That's good. That's a really helpful comment. I'm not sure I have a response, but I think that's really helpful.
Oh, we have 1 minute. Peter, you want to try?
Good. This comment is for Richard. I just wanted to go back to the point that John and Paul were trying to make. And it's not that like I fit a particular kind of description. I'm not bothered by that. But there are different kinds of descriptions. And I'm not sure if disrespect is the right criticism in this case. It might be something different. But if I fit certain kinds of descriptions like floral shirt, red sneakers, long hair, it's okay for you to stop me all the time even, right, on the basis of that kind of thing. But there are different kinds of descriptions that I might fit. And maybe it's disrespectful for the people who can't avoid to meet a particular kind of description to be stopped all the time. It's like being unable to see or to recognize the burdens that we put on certain groups of people. And maybe in those cases, we need more description, like a sufficient amount of description, so we won't treat all descriptions the same, right?
Yeah, I wonder if there could also be more thought about compensation of various sorts. It's one sort of compensation, of course, that we should endorse without even thinking about it, is just being really nice when you do it, even when he fits the description of the person who just robbed the store. You can be very pleasant about the whole thing until such time as he starts running or whatever. But, I don't know, maybe there are other ways one could compensate people. It's not a young man's fault that he's a young man, but you still got to stop him if you're rational more often at the airport. You say, it's not my fault. What am I supposed to do about being a young man? And it isn't his fault.
But your article is about cost-benefit analysis. So why isn't the simple thing just to add into the calculation the costs associated with the bad feelings that's produced in the people who are...
See, I think that'll do an awful lot. Just all these feelings. It doesn't even matter why the feelings arise. That the feelings arise is a huge cost. And feelings translate into action, too.
John, we're out of time, but if you want to keep fighting, it's your thing.
You had the power.
All right, well then, with apologies to